this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
I'd like to welcome to the podcast Dr. Ethan Mann. He's CEO of Validus Cellular Therapeutics, a cell-based antibacterial therapeutic company based in Aurora, Colorado. Dr. Mann is driving the early translation of the mesenchymal stem cell therapy to launch first in human trials. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Chadron State College and a PhD from the University of Nebraska. Dr. Mann trained as a postdoctoral fellow in infectious disease at Ohio State University. His academic career was dedicated to understanding how bacteria can cause chronic infections. That led to joining a startup called Sharklet Technologies in Aurora, Colorado, where he led scientific and strategic efforts to commercialize the infection-preventing texture. While at Sharklet, Dr. Mann completed an MBA with a specialization in finance. He also serves on the NIH review panels to evaluate small businesses' innovation research grants, which support commercialization of innovative technologies. Dr. Mann dedicates his volunteer time to the Colorado Bioscience Association and various community activities. He has been recognized as a distinguished young alumni by his undergraduate institution. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ethan Mann.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you, and I'm sure we'll have a lively conversation.
Absolutely. Hey, I wanted to just start with maybe on your background and one of the first companies that I saw you at. You were at Sharklet, so I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. My background is a little bit interesting, from a general, business perspective, but not all that interesting or different from a bioscience perspective. I think, I have this technical background in microbiology and a PhD studying infectious disease and specifically bacterial infections. And then I went on and did a postdoc following my graduate work. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Ohio State University where we were really looking at some of the, clinical effects of bacterial infections, specifically kind of chronic infections, and how, strategies we could take to kind of combat these devastating infections. And, kind of through that work, I got connected with a trade organization that was linked to a lot of industry advocates and pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies and manufacturers who are kind of dealing with the same scenario of how to deal with these persistent bacterial infections and how do we go about, either preventing or treating these infections. And I, through that work, got connected with Sharklet Technologies and kind of learned about Sharklet a little bit, which was a really interesting company dedicated to preventing bacterial infections on consumer products and medical devices through the use of texture. And so their concept was that this idea that sharks have a texture on their surface or on the denticles that make up their skin that prevents a lot of the fouling that we observe on humpback whales or manatees or sea turtles, other organisms in the ocean or submarines. And these sharks stay clean in part because of the texture. And it turns out you can actually recreate that texture, and then you can prevent some of the effects of bacteria sticking to surfaces. And so this was a really novel approach, didn't require the use of chemicals, of antibiotics or chemical agents on the surfaces. And so that you also avoid development of resistant sort of superbugs that have been so problematic in the healthcare system as well. And so this offered an opportunity to kind of control bacteria in a next generation approach. And I got involved with Sharklet and was there for 7 years, actually, kind of pioneering a lot of the early stage scientific work and demonstrating, the use of this concept of medical devices and consumer products and helping to deploy the technology and partner with institutions and medical manufacturers to really commercialize the technology. And it was there where I kind of got turned on to this startup world and the excitement, the highs and lows of entrepreneurialism and startups, but also kind of the everyday impact that you can have when you're working for a startup and you're one of a few people on a team. Maybe it's 10 people, maybe it's 20 people, but your daily impact is felt pretty heavily on the overall organization. And that's pretty exciting.
So what was your day like whenever you went into the office, kind of towards the end, I guess, of the 7 years, right? So, I mean, I would imagine at the early stages, you probably were doing a lot of very hands-on sort of development, but then, towards the end, tell me a little bit about what was the day in the life like then?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Early on, I was very hands-on. I think when I got to Sharklet, I was one of maybe eight people on the team, and we were doing really microbiology alongside an engineering team. So we were having to make the surface with this unique texture, and then develop methods to test it very accurately and specifically where methods didn't really exist in the standardized testing world or within test methods. And so that was very exciting because I had to understand a lot of the engineering aspects of what we were doing and how those engineering aspects might impact, the biological test methods we were using. So that was pretty exciting because I hadn't really worked on that much of an interdisciplinary team to that point in my career. And so I learned a lot about engineering. I'm dangerous around sort of manufacturing processes. Now I can ask questions of people that would surprise them, but I find it pretty interesting to be able to understand a little bit of the details of injection molding or embossing characteristics or overall high throughput manufacturing processes, extrusion and the like. So that was, really led me to developing a little bit more of the strategic focus of what Sharklet was doing. And in fact, how can we make things, or what can we make that's capable of a high throughput production mechanism that's going to have biological effect on the output. So what devices are accommodating for how they're made today, so that you can make a device with a Sharklet texture, but you're not going to have to reinvent the manufacturing such that the device is so much more expensive than what somebody would be willing to pay for a given biological outcome or a biological benefit or value proposition. And so that was pretty exciting. And we really defined a few key products that were pretty exciting. And then we did some translational studies on those devices and partnered with manufacturers to help kind of launch some of those initial devices. And so I really enjoyed that, which led to a little bit more of an operations role at Sharklet. And then kind of towards the end of my stint at Sharklet, we had gone through a financial acquisition with international investors in China in 2017. And I participated pretty heavily in that, especially within the technical aspects of what our technology was doing and how we convey that to consumers in China or to partners in China. And so following our acquisition, I was recruited to stay on and kind of transition the technology, both, with some launch and commercialization activities in North America and Europe, but also with supportive development activities in China. And so kind of towards the last few years of my time at Sharklet, I was really hopping on a lot of phone calls with folks to describe kind of what the value of Sharklet is, what maybe some of our limitations were, but where some of the sweet spots were in launching the technology and seeing that through to commercial success. And so, early on in conversations, I could work all the way from a pretty in-depth scientific analysis all the way to engineering and then commercial sort of marketing claims. And so I always enjoyed those conversations because I was so familiar with the technology as well as some of the other projects we've done that I could get to interesting aspects of deployment of the technology pretty easily.
And at some point while you're at Sharklet, then eventually you get approached, right, to present a talk at TEDx Mile High, which is something that I saw in your profile that I know I've watched a few times. And I mean, the one thing that really stands out to me that eventually I want to get to a question on is the shark denticles that you talk about, right? The skin of the shark and kind of the shape of that and how, remaking it, just helps to prevent a bit of bacteria as well. But so can you tell us a little bit about your TEDx Mile High experience as well?
Yeah, sure. So it's pretty interesting that the TEDx Mile High team has really developed a pretty sophisticated process to put on their productions that they do a couple times a year. And so, they really seek fairly interesting, innovative stories, not just within bioscience, obviously, but across all verticals, all industry aspects, social awareness, interaction, culture. And so it was a really interesting opportunity for me to be up on stage with maybe a dozen other speakers that had a lot of different background as me. And so one of the things that people sometimes don't understand about the TED process, where a TEDx will license kind of the TED process from the TED mothership and then train speakers on how to give the TED talk in the TED style. And so that's really the value of what's behind TEDx. And TEDx Mile High is actually one of the most productive sort of TEDx platforms around the world. And so it was a good opportunity for me to kind of go through that process. So they invited Sharklet to come give a talk, and you go through sort of 3 to 4 months of building kind of what you want your talk to look like, given, a period of time. Maybe it's 9 minutes or 11 minutes or something like that. The idea is actually the shorter talks can be, a lot of times more engaging because you get right into the meat of the talk and it moves along pretty quickly. But then it's a lot of practice of what is the talk, kind of what is your script, and then how do you give it? And then how do you give it in a very engaging manner? And so Helena, who runs the TEDx Mile High program as really their content producer, she's tremendous. She wrote for HBO. She wrote for some different miniseries that people are familiar with. So she really knows how to produce content. And she always said that, once you get your script written and memorized, you're 98% of the way there. But it's really the last 2% that makes up all the difference. And like everybody else on the internet, TEDx Mile High tracks views. And so certainly they're interested in getting views. And really it was that 2% difference at the end and finishing your memorization process such that you could give an engaging talk without having to think about, what elements of your talk you were going to give next or what your speaking style was going to be. It just became more of a natural process. And so that was challenging for me. I'm not a natural speaker, I wouldn't say super comfortable on stage, but it certainly gives you the tools necessary to be able to speak, in a different kind of setting and a different kind of more entertainment type setting.
So did you really feel like that last 2% allowed you to add more emotion and more inflection and just kind of really stress those last few points? Or was the last 2%, something else for you?
The last 2% typically is the emotional component. It was for me too. I would say I got 96% of the way there. And then the last 4% was really hard because I'm used to giving presentations and scientific presentations as a scientist. I get up and do, my PowerPoint. I walk people through a mechanistic understanding of molecular genetics of bacteria and all of that. I can do that, but that's different than TEDx Mile High. It's different than the TED process. And so Helena came to me, I think it was like shortly before I went on stage to give my talk. And she said, I never tell people this, but you might want to consider just talking faster. She's like, you're a little bit like a little robotic in your presentation. She's like, the emotion that you have will come through if you just kind of speed it up a little bit and flow a little bit more comfortably. And she's like, don't worry if you move off your script or something a little bit, and that actually helped me quite a lot. And so she kind of knows what she's doing, and they end up being very successful. I think they say, of 12 or 15 presentations they'll get, I don't know, 4 or 5 per event that get posted on the TED.com front page. And so that's really where TED pulls kind of the TEDx talks from around the world that are most exciting and most impactful and most emotional. And they promote those on their front page. And so TEDx Mile High is one of the most prolific in that regard. So, and it comes through, and it's a fun experience for sure. I had a lot of fun with that. And I tell the story of kind of the discovery of Sharklet and the founder of Sharklet. So if folks are interested, go check it out. It's a fun story of how a discovery happens and launches a startup.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent story in general, right? And what we'll do is, so in the show notes, I will make sure that I link your talk, back so that people can go back and check it out. But that leads me kind of to my last question about Sharklet anyway, is, so tell me about the dendrils, right? So whenever I saw the picture in the presentation that you gave at TEDx Mile High, each skin cell on the outside of a shark reminded me kind of like a shark tooth. So if you could think of almost like this armor on the outside of the shark that looks like shark teeth, you could kind of visualize a little bit what it might look like. But I was thinking that the whole reason why sharks don't collect barnacles is because the skin moves. So whenever you create the static sort of, replication of the shark skin, it doesn't move, but it also prevents bacteria. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So from a shark skin perspective, they have these, they're called denticles or dermal denticles. So skin is almost like skin teeth. If you want to think of like a shark tooth, they basically have teeth on their skin. And it makes up like this armor, overlapping armor, kind of like scales. And they kind of overlap to create a diamond shape of a scale on their skin, and that's the dermal denticle. And those have this texture on them. They have ridges and valleys that create a surface energy change that's pronounced enough to change a biological response in this area. And yes, the shark skin moves, but at some point, the nature of kind of this fouling event or this dirtying of surfaces in the ocean starts with the initial attachment of bacteria and very small organisms, zoospores, all the way up to like massive barnacles that you can see, when a whale kind of jumps out of the water. And they do that, they breach a lot of times to just slap a lot of that fouling off of the surface. So they'll breach and slap down on the water because of that. Yeah, and sharks don't do that because they have this texture on their skin. And so the bio-inspiration from this texture on shark skin had everything to do with the texture. And Dr. Brennan, who really discovered this element at the University of Florida, was already studying how surface texture can impact biological adhesion, but he was using sort of microtextures that had repeating, bumps and valleys or pillars or something like this, but they were all very repeating patterns. Well, what happened is he created a diamond-shaped structure, which was the revealed sort of surface of that dermal denticle that created a diamond that had features of varying size repeating over the surface. So it was that dynamic feature size and shaping combination that really produced the most beneficial surface energy change relative to the texture that was being used. And it was actually that diamond shape with varying feature size that Sharklet used really as a conserved approach to starting with texturing surfaces for desired outputs. And we use changes in surface energy for all types of applications, as it turns out, more than just controlling bacteria. We knew, we were looking at how we change surface energy to impact, attachment of blood cells that could cause clotting. We were looking at changes in textures to prevent sticking of various substances in a manufacturing process to a conveyor belt. All of these things, we were looking at all sorts of stuff, even how water interacts with a surface in a sporting event or something like this. So you could actually manipulate how a surface functions under various elements where you're wanting to control certain things. And so we started to understand a lot more about general surface energy, really from this ability to microtexture surfaces.
It's just so interesting. I mean, I almost could listen all day about how you guys engineered that. But one great thing is we have even more to continue to share, right? So today, you're CEO of Validus. I'd love for you to go into a little bit about what are you doing today? What is Validus and what are you currently working on?
Yeah, so I had kind of got hooked on this startup world, and we kind of wrapped up my role, at least with Sharklet, in transitioning the technology to the new owners, and they're really partnering with folks heavily and launching products, and a lot of that is occurring overseas today because that's where our owners were at. Eventually, you'll probably see these Sharklet products globally, but I had the opportunity to hop to a different startup venture that I found kind of in my backyard here in Colorado at Colorado State University that I felt like I was a really good fit to lead. And so I took advantage of that. And I'm CEO of this company, Validus Cellular Therapeutics, and we're just launching, just kind of getting off the ground. We licensed technology that was jointly developed by Colorado State and the University of Colorado. And the founding inventor is Dr. Stephen Dow, who's a veterinarian scientist at Colorado State. So for those who aren't aware, Colorado State happens to be one of the world's leading veterinary schools. And so there's a lot of exciting research and therapeutic developments coming out of that vet school, largely for animals, but also can be extrapolated to human therapeutics. And so that's what we're finding with this case. And so this kind of happened at the time where I was looking for the next venture to approach. And being an infectious disease guy and someone who's really kind of passionate about addressing these chronic resistant infections that so many people deal with, and we're losing the fight with these chronic infections. We're losing the ability to treat chronic infections because of the antimicrobial resistance that's emerging so heavily. And so we need different approaches. Sharklet was one of those, and a very preventative approach. But I really was asking the question, why can't we develop a new therapeutic that maybe isn't reliant on a static chemistry, maybe isn't reliant on a peptide or an enzyme that we inject to somebody and balance the interplay of effect and toxicity that can be so difficult to really progress through a pharmacological development process. And so I got turned on to the world of cell therapies, which is really emerging. I mean, it's been around in the academic world and some early stage research and development, but really hasn't had the foundation within the regulatory environment to really support broad commercialization that you're seeing more now than ever. And there's a lot of cell therapy approaches being used in cancer or neurodegenerative diseases or immunomodulatory aspects of autoimmunity and other things, but there's really not any work being done on how to use cell therapies for infectious disease and specifically bacterial infections. And one of the only groups that was really looking at this approach happened to be Dr. Dow at CSU. And so I just kind of approached Dr. Dow about his technology and the opportunity to come on with Validus and kind of lead what they're doing based off my background. And we really hit it off and thought it would be a good fit for what we need to do. And so we've been putting the foundations in place to make that happen, which involves a lot of planning, regulatory strategy, partnering with key partners either in the area or nationally to make sure we have kind of our ducks in a row as we go out and work to commercialize this thing as efficiently as possible. And so we've gotten enough of the planning done now, and we're basically out fundraising to finance the project, which always presents itself in a myriad of facets.
It's got to be scary as COVID comes on, right? And then you're out looking for funding. What has that been like for you?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We were ready to just go out and present at all these investor conferences and get in front of, a few key folks that we had really identified as good potential financiers right at the beginning of March, right as the world was kind of dealing with the onset of and the reality of what this coronavirus, kind of global pandemic was going to mean. And essentially at that point, the private capital markets really really hit pause on everything and turned inward to their own portfolios to make sure that they could support their own portfolio companies to be successful and kind of make it through whatever this global pandemic looked like. And so we kind of had to do the same thing. We hit pause, made sure that, we were working on our story. I took the opportunity to talk to more people in the regulatory space and biomanufacturing space to make sure that we were thinking about everything that we were going to need to do and fine tuning our story. And so that's kind of what we did. And then, say end of May, June, people started to come back out from the rock they crawled under and realize that, while it was going to be a change and maybe a change for a little while, we were going to need to be able to hit at least do some of the business and hit some of the milestones we had projected at the beginning of the year, both within the capital markets and within operating companies. And so people have been more active, albeit, kind of on Zoom or on computers or on phone calls, but there's activity at least.
Yeah, really good to hear. I mean, it's an important topic, right? Okay, so I've got a couple of last questions here before we finish up. So first of all, just wanted to jump into, what inspires you?
Yeah, so I think that truly what drives me the most, and it's taken a little while to get, my understanding around this, it's the pursuit of challenges. It's identifying sort of how things work at a mechanistic level. So I early on, I got involved in the scientific world because I really was drawn to the core elements of how things work, whether it's chemistry or biology, human biology. All of that was really interesting to me, microbiology, and I went fairly deep on that between a PhD and a postdoc and understanding, medicine so that I, could hope to translate that to something impactful. And so we did that with Sharklet a little bit. But during my time at Sharklet, I also understood that, to be able to take an interesting technology to the patient or to the consumer marketplace or whatever the case may be, you needed to have a concise commercialization process that involved the financial aspects of what you were doing. Because you can make really cool things, but if they're so expensive that no one will buy them or you can't match the value proposition, then it's a futile effort. And so I went off and got an MBA in finance as well in the evenings while I was at Sharklet because I understood pretty quickly that finance was really driving a lot of the core elements of what we were experiencing, either in our macro or micro economies, within our family households, within a lot of the things that we see in society. If you follow the money, you'll understand why things happen, at least to some degree. And so that's really, it's fairly clear that's what drives me. And then, collaboration is the other aspect of that. Just interacting with people, learning stories, learning what people do or how they approach problems is very exciting. And then being able to share as well, if that's helpful, is always motivating as well. But those are the core elements that I've always found to get me focused on a project.
Absolutely inspiring to hear kind of the story overall, right? That you've used and leveraged your education to go back and see how it will affect the world. So thank you for that. One last question. So in overall, what concerns you? What are your thoughts about the future? What concerns you?
What I'm focused on primarily is trying to leverage a novel therapeutic through a commercialization process that really relies on capital markets, on free market enterprise. All of these aspects of building a value proposition, need to be in place. And certainly there's supportive efforts involved with that. There's some existing legislation within the United States that helps kind of prop up the development of antimicrobial therapy specifically. And there are other models like that. But I think we have to be able to support business in a fruitful manner so that it is mutually beneficial for everybody. We have to understand that if shareholders, whether you're investing in a private company or you're buying stock on the stock market, a corporation is beholden to its shareholders. And so as a pharmaceutical producer, I have to make sure that my shareholders are benefiting from the work that we're doing. Now, that can happen within reason, but if I'm not looking out for the best interest of my shareholder, then I'm not doing my job as a CEO of a corporation. And so there are specific corporation laws that actually state that that's supposed to be the case. And that's what people rely on when they purchase securities in a corporation. And so I think that, everyone kind of has to keep that in perspective, that a lot of the progress we've made so far has really been the benefit of a lot of commercialization activities. And there's always a balance between the regulation side of things and commercialization side and capitalization of novel ideas. But that's really the core of how you develop something in a timely fashion, how you develop something that can benefit the masses. And in fact, I guess we're probably seeing that today more than ever with the coronavirus vaccines and some of the therapeutics, where industry, large pharma is still working to develop therapeutics, but they started with a little bit more of an even playing field because there was such a huge need that they all got together and said, okay, how do we think creatively about solving this problem at the same time and working together? We understand everyone is going to benefit from this. Everyone's corporation is going to do well, and its shareholders are going to benefit as well. And that model is going to persist, I think, longer than even the coronavirus that we're dealing with. And we saw that recently with the launch of the AMR Action Fund, so Antimicrobial Resistant Action Fund, and large entities, Pfizer, Novartis, others, have put in globally into a $1 billion antimicrobial resistance action fund to come up with 2 to 4 novel therapeutics in the next 3 to 5 years. And so that's really their goal, is say, okay, this is a huge problem. No one's really got it figured out. In fact, we don't really even know where we're headed with this thing. How do we develop a process similar maybe to the coronavirus vaccine process that could be beneficial for solving, or at least stemming the tide on the antimicrobial resistance side of things? So I think it's really, hopefully we continue to have a collaborative environment moving forward. I would hate to see us, sort of degrade into silos as a result of maybe being in our home offices too much, or, not interacting on a personal level into the future because of fears around, a global pandemic or a contagious virus or other things, whatever the next thing is that's going to come about. I think that interpersonal interaction is so critical to inspire folks or mentor younger colleagues or whatever the case. I mean, it's just, you never really know what's going to happen when you go to a networking event. It's always a lot of fun because of that. And I would hate to see that go away.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here. How can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out to you?
Yeah, I would say the best, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am pretty active on LinkedIn. That's probably the social media that I use the most. I have a little bit of Twitter activity, but less frequent sort of interaction on a personal level. And that's probably the easiest. You can look me up on my TED Talk. You can reach out to me in various forms. I'm always happy to talk to folks about career development or aspects of scientific development or all the other things that I talked about. So feel free to reach out as people are interested.
Thank you so much. So I'll include that as well in the show notes. Thanks again for doing this with me. I greatly appreciate it. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Don.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.